Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. The United States, for the first time in 2 years, requested a UN Security Council meeting on North Korea's provocations. North Korea criticized this move and emphasized it has nothing to lose. Today we find out whether North Korea has nothing to lose or has everything to lose.
They could even test launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are designed to attack the continental United States with nuclear weapons.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining me, Ms. Olivia Enos, a senior analyst at the Heritage Foundation and a columnist with the Forbes magazine. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Mr. Jannuzi, after North Korea conducted an important test at the Seohae satellite launching site, the United States convened a Security Council meeting for the first time in 2 years. Why do you think the United States is utilizing the United Nations rather than taking a unilateral approach?
Well, at this critical juncture, I think both the United States and the DPRK are posturing and sparring in the run-up to the end-of-year deadline that the North has attempted to set for diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea. And I think the United States is anticipating that they may have a rough year ahead, and they're going to need to marshal international public opinion and international support, potentially to reimpose stricter sanctions on North Korea. So they're beginning to lay the groundwork for that kind of diplomatic effort in the year ahead.
Mm-hmm. Because this is such a sensitive time, is it the United States doesn't want to take strong unilateral actions to make North Korea angry at the United States?
I think what we're witnessing right now really is a war of words between North Korea and the U.S. And I think it makes a lot of sense that they are going to the UN because when the U.S. is pressing North Korea, whether it's in negotiations in Singapore and Hanoi, they're really pressing them to comply with the law, whether that's U.S. law through the unilateral sanctions that we've instituted or UN through the multilateral sanctions that we've instituted. And I think the US wants to make sure that it has other countries on its side because we really have seen over the past several months, China, Russia, and others weakening their sanctions enforcement. And so I think they're wanting to say, okay, let's see where others are at, whether they're going to have our back, and how do we sort of form a coalition to hold North Korea accountable, given that they are being so provocative, not only through the tests, but also in their rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. And Ms. Enos, UN Ambassador Kelly Craft said that while she warned against North Korea's possible provocations, she also said the United States is ready to be flexible. Do you think the United States is showing any signs of being flexible? Because Special Representative Egan back in June already mentioned about the importance of being flexible.
Yeah, I think some of the rhetoric toward flexibility is a little bit concerning. I mean, of course, we want to keep the door open for future negotiations. We want there to be the possibility of denuclearization, but we're hearing from North Korean foreign ministry officials that denuclearization isn't even on the table anymore. If that's not the case, then North Korea is openly and explicitly stating that they're willing to violate laws that they've been in violation of for a long time. And one of my big fears heading into the new year is that they've used this time when negotiations were ongoing to really firm up and continue to develop their nuclear program. And so, I mean, we can never predict the future. We don't have, a glass ball to look into and say, okay, here's what the future is going to be. But I think a lot of folks are worried that they really have been improving and taking this extra time where maybe the U.S. has been a little bit more lax. We haven't seen as strong of a commitment to maximum pressure, whether that's maximum pressure in the sanctions context, or even the willingness to be critical on human rights grounds. There's really been this sort of weakening of the overall stance. And I think this is something that U.S. officials should avoid while still trying to maintain the door open to those continuing talks.
And Mr. Jannuzi, you recently met with a Special Representative Began, so maybe you have a better interpretation onto what he's saying by showing flexibility.
Well, I don't know if it's any better, but my take on it is a little bit different than Olivia's. I think the flexibility stance of the United States can be boiled down to the expression that the DPRK doesn't need to do everything before the United States does something in response to those North Korean steps toward denuclearization. And I think that's a very realistic stance for the United States to take. Under the best circumstances, it would still require the United States and the international community several years to accomplish denuclearization of North Korea. So it's not practical for the United States to say to the North Koreans, you got to complete everything, you got to finish the deal before we respond positively. I do share Olivia's concern that if the United States softens our opposition to North Korea's human rights practices, if we signal to the North Koreans that they don't need to make other changes to accommodate the international norms that they are violating on a daily basis, that somehow we will overlook that. I think that would be a mistake.
So Special Representative Began, it sounds like he's open to phased approach, the step-by-step approach, the reciprocal approach, which many analysts had been saying that Special Representative already endorses that idea. And going into the Hanoi summit, people were expecting small deal. But then at the last minute, Ambassador Bolton and President Trump called for complete denuclearization. So is now United States going back to the earlier small deal approach?
Well, my understanding is that in Stockholm, the United States did make several new innovative sort of offers to North Korea, essentially restoring a degree of flexibility and incrementalism to the U.S. approach. Whether this reflects President Trump rethinking his hard line in Hanoi, I'm not sure. But again, it's pretty clear to me that the U.S. would like to make some progress, both for political reasons for the president, but also more fundamentally in order to stabilize the situation on the Korean Peninsula. And I think that the U.S. government has decided that an incremental step-by-step approach is the only practical way to try to get the process moving at this current logjam.
I wanted to respond to Frank's earlier comments about flexibility and timing. I think that no one expects that denuclearization is going to happen overnight. I agree with you, Frank. It's impractical to expect that the lights are just going to switch and it's going to be a new reality. But we don't even have a commitment from North Korea to complete verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of its nuclear program, which is the legal standard that's required both through UN sanctions but also through US sanctions. And I think that you have to get that starting point right, that foundation, in order to be able to build on that productively. And so when I hear flexibility from Steve Began, it makes me worry that we're moving away from that legally required standard, and that makes me very concerned.
Many people are actually raising the possibility that U.S. may be going for a small deal before the end of the year. And I think Ms. Enos is raising concerns over that idea. And Ms. Enos, it appears the U.S. is out for a very flexible approach, but North Korea is shutting down on all the opportunities to talk with the United States. Why do you think is that?
I mean, I think that North Korea may be recognizing that it had the time during the negotiation process to really continue to develop its program. And I think they may be sort of taking stock of that and saying, it really doesn't matter anymore whether or not the international community recognizes us as a nuclear state or not. And I think they may continue business as usual. They may actually see the status quo, while not ideal, and certainly not ideal for the people of North Korea, many of whom are having food insecurity issues. There's 80,000 to 120,000 individuals inside those political prison camps. This status quo is untenable for the North Korean people. But for the regime that continues to enrich itself through evading sanctions and otherwise, this status quo is somewhat acceptable.
So on Ms. Enos's point about the status quo, that kind of develops into this North Korea's rhetoric these days that it has nothing to lose. What do you make of it?
Well, they have a lot to lose. The North Korean economy is muddling through. But North Korea cannot accomplish any of its long-term objectives in terms of modernization and economic growth and prosperity and strength absent a relief from these international sanctions. Moreover, the regime itself and their security is not guaranteed as long as there is a state of war between the United States and North Korea. The North Korean leadership itself is threatened. So they have a lot to lose. But they're posturing. They're trying to say to the United States, we will not be bullied.
So, Ms. Enos, what is your take that North Korea has nothing to lose?
I think that North Korea, like Frank, I agree, has quite a lot to lose. And I think it's not just merely international legitimacy, which I do think was one of the original draws for Kim Jong-un to come to the summit in Singapore, to come to the table in Hanoi. I think that they have a lot to lose because if they do want to be seen as a legitimate leader on the international stage, and if they do want to start enjoying some of the prosperity that is involved in being a normal part of the international system, they have to denuclearize and they have to stop this rhetoric that is overly aggressive toward the rest of the international community.
Is this the best chance that North Korea can get, the alignment of leaders in South Korea and the United States?
I think that's always a tricky one to argue with. I mean, you can never predict who will be president in the future, either in South Korea or here in the US. I will say that the door is more open to negotiations now than I would anticipate being under a different administration. And obviously, we don't know what's going to happen in 2020. But all that being said, I think that North Korea could continue with its provocations, could continue with its negative activities for a long time. People have been predicting that North Korea is going to collapse for a very long time, and it hasn't. It's remained resilient. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the North Korean leadership is incredibly corrupt and has been able to evade the international system for a really, really long time.
Right. Mr. Jannuzi, so North Korea said that the UN Security Council meeting decisively helped us make a definitive decision on what way to choose, talking about the new way. So does it mean that North Korea has now come to a conclusion to make a major provocation in the new year?
Well, most likely what it means is that North Korea already is essentially closing the door on the Trump administration, at least in their first term. If Trump wins a second term, they will inevitably have to reopen that diplomacy door. But for now, they seem to be resigned to a year ahead, which is going to be one of tit-for-tat actions, provocations, if you want to call them that. But one way or another, North Korea is already beginning to posture about who is to blame for the collapse of negotiations with the United States. And they're basically saying to the international community, we didn't do it. You know, they're trying to attribute the responsibility onto President Trump's shoulders. I think that's unfair. I think the Trump administration has held the door open as long as they possibly can for diplomacy to North Korea. And I think it's North Korea that essentially has been unresponsive.
And Ms. Enos, what do you make of it that President Trump recently said that he did not believe Chairman Kim wished to interfere with the U.S. elections?
Well, just really quickly, I think what we're going to see at the start of 2020 is a return to business as usual prior to the Singapore summit, prior to the Hanoi summit. But I think what makes it more pernicious in 2020 is not necessarily that North Korea is going to pull out the big guns or do anything that would be virtually suicidal if they were to try an attack on the U.S. or I would say even a more major attack on South Korean territory. What worries me right now at this moment is that the Trump administration has not done a good job of alliance management. And so right now, you have allies who are at odds with each other. The tension between Korea and Japan has definitely caused ramifications and consequences, I think, even for the strength of each bilateral alliance between the U.S. and South Korea, U.S. and Japan, but certainly in trilateral cooperation. And if we're heading for greater provocations on the Korean Peninsula, that makes me extraordinarily worried. To your second point, you know, I think there's a lot of posturing around the elections, and with the impeachment negotiations going on, that's obviously an area of focus that has the president's mind and attention right now. That's also worrisome because it means that his mind isn't focused on some of the major foreign policy threats that are ahead. And so I think we're going to have to watch very closely to see how all of this unfolds in 2020.
So my last question to you, do we still have the window for opportunity for a breakthrough in diplomacy within this year, do you think?
It's open a crack. You know, and
especially Special Representative Begin's trip to Korean Peninsula.
Well, sure. I mean, I think Steve Biegun will try until the last moment to get a deal. I think the likelihood of succeeding is low, but it's the job of diplomats to turn the impossible into the unlikely. A deal is extremely unlikely, but he will keep trying till the end. I think already the United States and North Korea are beginning to think about what comes next.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the discussion we have for the part one, and now watch a video for a second discussion.
We should not forget the suffering of the North Korean people. The human rights situation in North Korea is disturbing.
The UN Security Council meeting on North Korea's missile and nuclear activities effectively blocked a council discussion on North Korea's human rights situation. Activists point out this is the second year in a row that the U.S. prevented council scrutiny on North Korean human rights. Now, Ms. Enos, Ambassador Bolton, in reaction to the latest blocking of the UN Security Council human rights discussion on North Korea, Ambassador Bolton said we should take the lead and not obstruct other nations. And Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden said that we betrayed our values. And former UN Ambassador Samantha Power said that this is shameful. Do you share with their criticism?
I think it's a huge mistake to leave human rights issues off the table when we're talking about North Korea. The Kim regime needs to be held accountable for the severe human rights violations that are ongoing, not only because it's the morally right thing to do, but also because it's actually the strategic thing to do as well. I believe that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, its chemical and biological weapons programs, wouldn't be what they are today without them either being tested on vulnerable populations there or using the labor of North Koreans inside, in particular, the political prison camps that are allegedly used toward that program. With that being said, I think what's so alarming about this year's decision to not hold the discussion on human rights issues was that in the year prior, it was because the U.S. didn't whip the number of votes that they needed in order to have this discussion. This year, they supposedly did whip the votes, and it was the U.S. who refused to go ahead with this. The U.S. has long been a beacon of liberty. I think Ronald Reagan really called us to our better selves when he said that we should be the shining city on a hill. And I think this is really a betrayal of those values to not go forward with a discussion like this.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Jannuzi, you are Deputy Executive Director of Amnesty. What is your take on the latest decision?
For the human rights commitment of the United States to be credible, it has to be consistent and endurable. You don't turn it on and off to suit the timelines of a particular international negotiation. And in this case, to essentially pull the rug out from under the international community's scrutiny of North Korea's human rights activities is especially wrong-headed because it's based on the false premise that somehow this will make the North Koreans more amenable to the U.S.-North Korean denuclearization talks. It won't. They will perceive it as a sign of weakness and insincerity in terms of our commitment to the human rights issue, and they won't reward us for it at all. And it's also based, I think, on another false assumption, that the North Koreans are so thin-skinned that if we were to criticize their human rights record, that they're going to fold their tent and go home and not participate in negotiations for peace and denuclearization. The track record shows that this is incorrect. The North Koreans are perfectly able to absorb the criticism and proceed with talks.
On the contrary, Ms. Enos, isn't North Korea very sensitive about the criticism, especially when it comes to its human rights? UN Ambassador Kim Sung circulated a letter to the UN Security Council members. What is your take?
I mean, I think actually the negotiations process leading up to Singapore demonstrated that North Korea can handle the raising of human rights abuses. And the examples that I would point to are the return of the 3 Americans, but also even talking about some of the return of the American remains. I think we need to transition from solely focusing on American lives, those who are detained. Obviously, that's a priority of the US government, to also focusing on the human rights violations against the North Korean people themselves. And I think we did see strong rhetorical commitment by the president and also others in the administration prior to Singapore, especially after the return of Otto Warmbier. But you still saw North Korea coming to the table for negotiations. That's why I believe that these issues can be raised in tandem. I just think that there is a prevalent view in Washington, especially among diplomats, that bringing up human rights issues will somehow obstruct our ability to make diplomatic progress in other arenas. And I think this has been proved false time and time again.
And Mr. Jannuzi, although the United States made this latest decision, the State Department always announces annual report on human rights and criticizes North Korean human rights. And also, there were 7 different occasions where North Korean defectors visited White House this year. So isn't it disputable that the United States is somehow sidelining the human rights issue for the sake of denuclearization negotiation?
Well, I think the decision just made to yank the UN Security Council discussion of human rights says everything you need to know. But if you weren't convinced that this administration is not being sufficiently consistent in their commitment to human rights, you need to look no further than the failure to appoint a U.S. ambassador for North Korean human rights issues. That post has been vacant since the beginning of the Trump administration. So you've had 3 years with an essential vacancy. The person that's supposed to be in charge of that dialogue.
But what I hear is that actually the special representative for North Korea actually assumes the role of the North Korean human rights ambassador. Isn't that enough?
It's not enough, and I have no evidence or reason to believe that human rights issues have been prominent in any of the dialogue with North Korea over the last 3 years.
So, Ms. Enos, the latest decision for the United States to not hold the human rights meeting, that could be interpreted as appeasing North Korea. So these actions of appeasing North Korea, did it bring about any progress in denuclearization talks?
I mean, I think that kind of remains to be seen, but I don't think that this is the right gesture to make if you were trying to keep the door open. And in fact, I think there's been other ways in which certain human rights or humanitarian issues have been politicized unnecessarily for the sake of keeping the door open. For example, Special Representative Began has often said that humanitarian aid was something that was on the table in sort of a small deal. Humanitarian aid isn't supposed to be politicized. It's either given or it's not given. It's either effective or it's not effective. And I think the politicization of an issue like this is really a shame, because I think U.S. advocacy of human rights needs to be, as Frank said earlier, consistent in order for it to be effective. And so I think that we need to see a stronger commitment, not only rhetorically, but also in action.
We'll have to leave it here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of Samjiyon, a newly opened mountain resort in North Korea. North Korea called this place an epitome of modern civilization and the self-reliance policy. Chairman Kim started developing Samjiyon in 2013 and newly constructed sports and cultural facilities, hotels, and hospitals. Frank?
Well, you know, when Myanmar opened to the world, one of the reasons they did so was because the sons and daughters of the elite were deprived all of the sort of luxury experiences that other sons and daughters of elite people in Asia can enjoy. And this whole resort speaks to the commitment of Kim Jong-un to catering not to the needs of the ordinary North Korean people, but to the elite. And the elite want playgrounds. And so this is a playground for the elite. And it says a lot about where the North Koreans are prioritizing their investments.
Olivia?
I totally agree with Frank. For me, I just think of how there must have been a lot of sanctions evasion involved in order to put this in place and to have so many luxury goods, luxury products that are no doubt sold here. And it just makes me think that there needs to be a commitment to maximum pressure, not only for a denuclearization purpose, but for the North Korean people, that the human rights elements of the sanctions that are mandated by law should be enforced as well.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Jannuzi, Ms. Enos, thank you for joining us.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.